Thanks to all of you who are dialing in for this talk. Just a quick, my disclosures, main bit just to point out is I have received speaker fees from Sanofi about influenza vaccines, so not exactly directly related to what I'm talking about today. Just start off with the influenza vaccine recommendations by WHO. Nothing I'm going to argue with here too much. So these are the standard groups that very sensibly are recommended to receive annual influenza vaccination. But of course, we know that the current influenza vaccines which are available are not that effective. So there are a few different systematic reviews which have looked into this, and here's one of the more recent ones. So overall pooled effectiveness against influenza is 41% with inactivated vaccination. And then when you break it down by the specific subtype, it's lowest for H3N2. And if you go further and look to see where there is antigenic match between the vaccine and the circulating strains, there is very little effectiveness of the influenza vaccines when there is significant mismatch between these viruses. So the options we have for control of influenza, well, maybe we should just give up and stop vaccinating. This isn't exactly what's happened recently. So here is data from the US of the number of vaccine doses which have been distributed in the US season over the past 40 years. And there was quite an increase in the number of vaccines distributed last year in efforts to try and prevent a twindemic. So measures being relaxed because of COVID, concern that there will be outbreaks of both COVID and flu resulted in significant measures to try and increase uptake in the US and also in Europe. So this is OECD data, so it's not all from Europe. Don't have data for all countries for the 2020/2021 Northern Hemisphere season. But of all the countries listed there on the left, there was an increase in vaccination rates. So this is actual uptake of vaccination amongst older adults. And it's been reported that vaccine supply increased by 30% in Europe for last season in efforts to prevent a twindemic. Things perhaps a little bit different in Asia though. So this was in the news, I'm sure you remember from last year, October 2020, when there were reports of deaths associated with the influenza vaccine in South Korea, and daily there were reports of further deaths. Resulting in Singapore and in Malaysia in temporary cessation of the use of 2 influenza vaccines, whilst it was confirmed that these deaths were not actually related to the vaccine. But that had a significant impact on uptake of the vaccine in Korea. So there was a significant drop. This is shown here in this bar chart with the decline in the green part, the proportion who are vaccinated from the 2019 to 2020 season to the 2020 to 2021. Now, last year might have got away with it because it turns out we didn't have a twindemic. So this is the global data from the GISRS system of influenza cases detected per week around the world. So the 2 standard spikes of the Northern Hemisphere winters in 2018/2019 and 2019/2020. And then a big drop since then. And there's been very little influenza detected since. But as the Singapore Police Force might say, low flu doesn't mean no flu. And we are still detecting influenza around the world, predominantly in the tropical belt. And most subtypes and types of influenza have been detected. I'll just put some data in here from the China CDC of their influenza detections over the past 6 months or so, given that they have had less controls, at least within country. And there has been a significant outbreak of B. Victoria within China, so still ongoing within southern China, seems to have peaked and passed in northern China, which is figure 2 here. Interestingly, B. Yamagata has not been detected worldwide. Whether that is because we've just missed it or whether it has actually become extinct, we don't know. But AH1, AH3, B. Victoria are really just waiting for safe management measures to be relaxed further and for travel to increase between countries for there to be a significant outbreak. So I think giving up and stopping vaccinating is probably not a good option. Alternatives we have. We could vaccinate closer to the start of the season. And this is perhaps like a lot of influenza vaccinology, not new. So waning of protection after vaccination has been reported since the vaccines were first in production from Francis and Salk back in the 1940s. And this was a human challenge study which they conducted in 1942 at the Ypsilanti State Hospital. This is what it looked like before it was knocked down a few years ago. And they took people who had been vaccinated and exposed them to influenza and looked at the rates of fever subsequently. And for people who had been recently vaccinated compared with people who had been vaccinated more than 4 months ago, there was a significantly higher rate of fever greater than 37.8 degrees C amongst those who had been vaccinated more than 4.5 months ago. So that protection against influenza that is induced by the vaccine doesn't last for long. It is not new news, but it's something that perhaps has got a little bit lost over time. And this was a systematic review and meta-analysis of change in vaccine effectiveness that we conducted looking at test-negative design case control studies. And what these test-negative design studies has done was they looked at vaccine effectiveness in the first 15 to 19 days after vaccination compared with the subsequent 30 days, subsequent 90 days, 91 to 180 days after vaccination. There have been several studies which had reported this. We had data for it from 11 studies for influenza A H3, and there was a significant change in vaccine effectiveness across those 2-3 month periods. So a decline from significant protection in the first 3 months after vaccination to no significant protection 3 months later. For influenza B, at least with these studies, there was a decline as well, though there was still significant protection seen later on in the season. For H1, the decline, for what it's worth, was not significant. It's a little bit odd using a test-negative design case control study to look at this in some ways, because you're measuring vaccine effectiveness by studying people who are unvaccinated. And it makes more sense to take a group of people who have been vaccinated and compare how effective the vaccine has been between 2 different periods or multiple different periods post-vaccination. So this was a study published a couple of years ago which did that. And it was a large cohort study of people who had been vaccinated, had presented with influenza-like illness, and were tested for influenza and RSV. And we have the days since vaccination here, just to look at any influenza here to summarize. So separate the days since vaccination separated into 28-day periods. And as can be seen, there was a significant increased odds of influenza with time since vaccination, which was also to indicate that it was related to vaccination, was not seen with RSV. And it was consistent across influenza A and influenza B. And on average, this was the increased odds of infection, the increased odds of influenza per 28-day period after vaccination. This study was looking at outpatients. We performed a similar study, though retrospective, looking at influenza vaccine effectiveness against hospitalizations with time since vaccination. So this was conducted at Tan Tot Singh Hospital. We collected all the data from 4 years of influenza testing, matched up to identify those who had been vaccinated, and then looked to see how the odds of influenza varied with time since vaccination. So we had slightly larger intervals at which we were able to assess for a couple of reasons. We didn't have that many influenza infections which we could analyze, but also we were able to look over the whole year rather than studies which are performed in the temperate climates, which can only really look at influenza over 4 to 6 months. And we saw a significant decline in overall effectiveness of the vaccine against hospitalization with influenza, and similar trends when we break that down against H3, H1, and B. So the protection against influenza wanes with time since vaccination. The obvious resort to that, or the obvious answer to that in temperate climates, is to try and delay vaccination until just before the season. Give yourself the 2 to 4 week lag between vaccination and expected peak and vaccinate at that point. But unfortunately, doing that trades off missing the peak. So this data is the summary from one season of vaccination uptake amongst older adults aged greater than 65 years in the United States. So the solid black line is vaccine uptake. The dotted line is the average time that there is, or the average proportion of average risk of influenza per month for multiple seasons. And the difficulty with this is we can move the line across and move the vaccine uptake so it's closer to the timing of the peak, but that risks that you may have an earlier influenza season than expected, and then a significant proportion of people will not have been vaccinated yet or will not be protected. So it's a problem with the variable timing. The other problem is just that delaying vaccination may also reduce uptake of the vaccine, which then means that by deferring, you are reducing the protection in the population. And furthermore, we don't quite understand the rate and the pattern of waning of vaccine effectiveness. So it may just decline steadily across an influenza season. It may decline slowly to a plateau, or it may follow, probably what is the case, it will follow different patterns depending on exactly which influenza subtype is being studied and how it matches with the circulating strain. So it seems a good idea, but it's difficult to introduce that as a public health policy because of the problems with reducing uptake of the vaccine. It also doesn't quite make sense, as I've alluded to, in tropical countries, where the timing of influenza outbreaks is variable from year to year, and there are also multiple influenza peaks per year. So this was a study using WHO data that we did, which breaks down the patterns of influenza across a heat map for the countries listed there on the left in Asia. And it's reasonably clear that for those countries in the higher latitudes, so in temperate climates, there is a single influenza peak, which is reasonably consistent in its timing. But then as you move south and approach the tropical belt, that pattern breaks down, and there is influenza present throughout the year, but with multiple outbreaks across the year as well. So it makes it difficult to push the timing of vaccination closer to the timing of an outbreak. It also suggests that if influenza vaccine effectiveness wanes significantly over the first 4 months after vaccination, that perhaps we should be vaccinating more regularly in the tropics or in regions which have multiple influenza outbreaks per year. So we performed the Tropics One Study, which was a clinical trial that randomized 200 people to either once dose of the inactivated influenza vaccine, we had the trivalent at that point, or to a second dose 6 months later. So the control group received Tdap, so that we were giving them something useful. The vaccine strains between the vaccines administered at day 1 and day 180 were identical, and we were looking at immunological endpoints. So we were looking at the HI titers at day 208, 28 days after the second dose was administered. And what we saw was that there was waning of immunity for the group. This is in the top charts here. So for the group who received annual vaccination, there was a general waning of titers. And for H1N1 and for H3N2, giving a second dose of the flu vaccine 6 months later significantly boosted the GMTs, so significantly boosted the titers compared with those who were unvaccinated. And we saw some signs that there may have been a lower rate of influenza-like illness amongst the group who received the second dose as well, though we were not able to measure influenza infections or PCR. We weren't able to perform PCRs to actually confirm whether there were influenza infections between these two groups. But as can be seen from those graphs, we then run into the other problem with influenza, or another problem with the influenza vaccine, which is that repeated doses of vaccination reduces the response. And in these three charts, we have H1N1, H3N2, and B on the right. And it compares the vaccine response by the post-vaccination titer compared against the pre-vaccination HI titer, and based on whether it was the first vaccination or the second vaccination. And so the pre-vaccination HI titer very clearly predicted the post-vaccination titer, but for people who received a second dose 6 months later, the titers didn't catch back up. So they weren't boosted back up to where they were after their first dose. The immune response was blunted. And this is something, well, it was also shown in that study which I presented earlier on from Francis and Salk back in the 40s. So they observed this issue. This is a systematic review published a couple of years ago, which looks at vaccine effectiveness in people who have received the vaccine for 2 consecutive seasons versus whether they received it in the current season or the previous season only. And particularly if you look at the bottom column here, for those who are vaccinated in both seasons versus those who are vaccinated in the current season only, receiving the both season vaccines resulted in significantly lower vaccine effectiveness. To some extent, there was catch-up. So when comparing the groups who had received vaccination for 2 consecutive years versus the people who received their last vaccine more than 1 year previously, there was evidence of effectiveness, but that effectiveness was significantly lower than people who were receiving their first vaccine dose. And in our cohort study looking at admissions to hospital with influenza, having received more than 1 vaccine in the past year was associated with more rapid waning, with lower protection against hospital admissions with influenza. So vaccinating multiple times per year is not quite a solution really either, at least not when the vaccine strains stay the same between consecutive northern and southern hemisphere winters. I think when the strains change, and what we saw with this study as well, when the strains change, it makes a lot more sense to vaccinate, particularly if there's been a significant change in what the predicted circulating strains are. So the third option we have is the enhanced inactivated vaccines. There are 3 vaccine types which are available, though that accessibility is limited in Asia. And at least from the Singapore point of view, none of these 3 vaccines are currently available in Singapore. So we have the high-dose vaccine, which contains 4 times the regular amount of hemagglutinin. That's compared with the standard dose vaccine. And in the clinical trial of that vaccine, efficacy compared to the standard dose was 24%. There are the recombinant influenza vaccines, which use a non-egg-based culture method. And this attempts to overcome some of the issues with egg adaptions from influenza viruses when they are grown within eggs, and has been particularly observed with H3N2. The flu block vaccine here contains 3 times the regular amount of hemagglutinin as well, and vaccine efficacy relative to the standard dose was 30%. And then finally, there's Fluad, which includes the MF59 adjuvant, but an otherwise standard inactivated vaccine. There are no clinical trials in older adults to confirm the efficacy of the vaccine, but multiple observational studies have put it in a similar sort of ballpark as the high dose and the recombinant vaccine, with a vaccine effectiveness of about 25%. This was a clinical trial to answer the question of how the immunogenicity of these different enhanced vaccines compare with the standard dose vaccine in one overall trial, which was conducted by Chong et al. In Hong Kong. So they've recruited almost 2,000 people and randomized them to either standard dose, adjuvanted, high dose, or recombinant influenza vaccine. I've just put in here the summary of those results, which essentially shows that there was an improvement in the HI titers, particularly for H3N2 and H1N1 for all of the enhanced vaccines compared with the standard dose. The ones at the end here that for B. Phuket, they are lower for the MF59 for the adjuvanted and the high-dose vaccine, as these were trivalent vaccines. So so relative to the standard dose, of course, there wasn't the boost. For the Brisbane strain, there was only a boost for the high dose. And then we have the Michigan and the Hong Kong vaccine strains. Sorry, let me go back. And the Hong Kong strain is the cell culture derived virus, whereas the Michigan one is the egg derived vaccine virus. So they do, as we would expect, improve, boost immunity compared with the standard dose vaccine. All the three do. And this one, I guess, would suggest that the recombinant vaccine may be the one which is most likely to provide better vaccine efficacy based on the fact that it is better matched to what is actually circulating versus the vaccine strains alone. And from this study as well, they also looked at the reactogenicity of the enhanced influenza vaccines and found that there was higher local reactogenicity with these enhanced vaccines, but the rates of systemic reactions were actually very similar. So from a safety perspective, there's no major concerns. And finally, and very quickly, just looking at the last point, which is new influenza vaccine designs. So this is the overview of the standard inactivated vaccines which are currently available. And hopefully, as a result of COVID-19 and the success of the messenger RNA vaccines, we will also see a successful influenza messenger RNA vaccine. There are 3 which are currently in clinical trials. The Moderna phase 1, phase 2 trial is reported to have completed recruitment in September 2021. And this is a quadrivalent vaccine targeting the hemagglutinin. And then we also have ones which are being produced by Sanofi and Pfizer, and 10 others which are in preclinical trials. But in addition to different types of vaccines, there is also looking at different targets. Hemagglutinin is the major target for protection, but rather than looking at the head of the hemagglutinin, which is variable between different vaccine strains, the other idea is a universal influenza vaccine which targets the stalk, and vaccines which which use the stalk as the target for the vaccine are currently in development. So hopefully we will see a final solution, which is an overall solution, which will be to produce better vaccines with better targets. And I'll just finish here with my acknowledgements from people who have helped me with these studies over the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you for that very insightful talk on the novel strategies with influenza vaccination. We have a rather long 3-part question from Julian Tang. The first part says, he comments, nice talk, Barnaby. And what do you know about the T-cell responses as opposed to the hemagglutinin antibodies in the waning influenza vaccine immunity?
So I think with the inactivated vaccines, we see quite poor T-cell stimulation anyway. So as part of the Tropics study, we did collect some cells to look at the T-cell responses, but we have not been able to analyze that data as yet. But I would not expect much of a difference because of the poor stimulation of T-cell immunity by these inactivated vaccines anyway.
Yeah, I think that's to be expected with influenza. And then this other part here about influenza vaccine efficacy endpoints is still mostly using culture, IF and PCR confirmed infection. But similar to the Delta variant of the COVID-19 infection, should we move towards a hospitalization endpoint, which may indicate a higher vaccine efficacy for influenza vaccines, as with COVID-19 vaccines? And anyway, most people in most countries just don't get vaccinated anyway and remain vulnerable.
Yes, I agree that we probably need to change the endpoints and following what's been done with COVID in terms of focusing on hospitalizations, serious infections,
Serious.
and also looking at non-infection associated endpoints. So when influenza triggers a MI or an exacerbation of heart failure or other conditions, COPD exacerbations and so on. I think these are important endpoints which need to be studied as well.
I think we can just scrape through with the last part. Have you found any evidence of different vaccine responses to influenza vaccines in temperate countries like US, UK, subtropical, example, Hong Kong, and tropical, for example, Singapore populations? Admittedly difficult to do because there's multiple potential confounders.
Yeah, that is difficult. I'm not aware of any studies which have really done that and used the same definitions. So there are a few studies which have compared vaccine effectiveness in different climates, and they generally find similar results in the same way that the burden from influenza is similar in different climates, even if the epidemiology is different. But what we really need is a study with the same definitions to then compare across these different groups, different countries.
So thank you very much, Barnaby. We've certainly enjoyed your lecture, and it's given us food for thought as we move into yet another flu season. We hope it won't be bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much.